We all saw the big turnout during the first week of early voting this week. Over 1 million voters have already cast their ballots in the presidential race between early voters and absentee voters. These Georgia voters are part of 7.6 million registered voters in Georgia, which is a new record. We also expect 5 million of them to cast ballots in this presidential election, which would also be a record. That's what makes Georgia a battleground state nationally, where it's in play for races for president, U.S. Senate, and U.S. House. I'm Mark Niesse, the voting rights and elections reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and this is the third of our weekly Facebook chats leading up to the 2020 election day on November 3rd. I'm joined today with a guest, Aunna Dennis, Executive Director for Common Cause Georgia, an organization that advocates for fair elections and government transparency. This week, we'll focus on what we can learn from Georgia's list of registered voters and how they might affect this year's elections. The voter registration in Georgia was October 5th. It already passed, but now that it has passed, we do know that there are nearly 7.6 million registered voters in Georgia. And you can find a lot of information from just looking at the public information from that voter list. We at the AJC, we requested every few months to get updates. It costs $250 to buy the full statewide list, but it gives you so much knowledge and information about who Georgia's voters are and how quickly Georgia is changing and growing. We just got a new list today. We haven't analyzed it yet, but we do know the bottom line number, almost 7.6 million voters, and that compares with just 7.4 million voters just 3 months ago. And in the 2016 election, it is up significantly from, let me see here, I almost lost that number, but it is up significantly from 2016. Yes, almost a million more voters from 4 years ago, which is really incredible when you think about the growth of the state and how engaged everybody is. A lot of the growth in Georgia's voter registration is because of automatic voter registration, which started in fall 2016. Anytime somebody gets a driver's license in Georgia, they are automatically registered to vote unless they opt out of the program. Before that, you had to specifically want to register when you came to vote. But now, most people, when they sign up to get a driver's license, which is a normal part of becoming a new Georgia resident, you do become a registered voter very quickly. And Georgia's growing population, you can see how it is changing electoral outcomes. Georgia has been a Republican-run state for a while now. I think 1992 was the last time that Georgia voted for a Democrat for president, and we've seen that continue over the years with comfortable margins for Republicans until recent years. It's getting closer and closer every election. In the 2018 election for governor, Governor Brian Kemp defeated Democrat Stacey Abrams by 1.4 percentage points. And you can see a pattern of how it is getting closer and closer every 2 years, every big election. And I'll talk more about those numbers in a little bit when we go into the details. But now I want to go back to Aunna Dennis. Common Cause is very involved in elections and voting in Georgia, advocating for several remedies to try to make voting more accessible for everyone. Earlier this week, the AJC and I wrote about their effort to boost the number of emergency paper ballots that would be on hand. A judge did not grant that request, but it is an interesting topic. If voting machines go down, if people have problems, if there are long waits at the polls, there are, under state regulations, already 10% of emergency ballots at each polling place, and they should be there and they should be used if needed. We have to wonder if that will be enough, if there are technical difficulties. But that's one example of the kind of work that Common Cause is trying to do to try to ensure that voters do have ways to cast their ballots even if there are problems. And so now I'll turn it over to Aunna Dennis, Executive Director for Common Cause Georgia.
Well, thank you, Mark, for having me. Common Cause Georgia, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit organization that works on efficacy, transparency, and making voting easier for our Georgians here in state. So we're happy to work with Mark and other folks to really amplify what is on the top of the T for voting in Georgia and how we can make sure that we can all get to the ballot box in a very fair, equitable, and safe way on November 3rd and before November 3rd.
Very good. What kind of hurdles are you watching out for that voters are facing when they are trying to cast their ballots this election season?
The hurdles. So, as we know in Georgia that voting hasn't been traditionally as easy here. We were a state that was covered under the Voting Rights Act, and in 2013 it was gutted. So pre-clearance was gutted, and so we saw that there was different changes that happened to elections that actually made it harder for people to be able to vote, like mass purgings happen, different things like precinct consolidations or last-minute changes to polling places. So we're making sure that we're watching out for those different types of issues. We're also watching out to make sure that we know what type of ballot a person is casting on election day. If they're casting a provisional ballot, if we're going into extended hours where an emergency ballot is needed to be cast. What's happening with our new technology here in Georgia? We have new technology with our poll pads, our voting scanners, our voting units, and all that is kind of in the legalese and stuff that folks really don't really need to kind of know about. We just need to know that our technology is a little bit different this time around. So the process of voting is a little bit different. And we also know that in Georgia that most voters don't touch the voting process maybe only every 4 years. We hope that everyone is a 365-day voter, but we know sometimes that's not the case because we have other things that are happening of how we enter the electoral system. So we're making sure that we can stay engaged, and we're making sure that we're very vigilant to track these types of problems with our election protection network and really amplifying what is needed to make sure that we are able to cast these safe, secure, and equitable ballots.
It's so interesting seeing the first week of early voting in Georgia when so many people have rushed out to the polls wanting to get their votes in. And you see long lines, and you can look at it a couple different ways. You can look at it like, oh my gosh, look at all these dedicated voters. Isn't this great? Everybody wanting to participate in democracy. But then you can also see it as, look at these long lines. How can we force these people to wait for hours to cast their ballot? How do you see long lines? Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? What are you looking out for?
So there's two types with this scenario. So I'll break it down as a simple math problem. So on the bad side of it, lines are long because we have a new technology, so our check-in process is a little bit different. Our voting units are not intuitively new or something that people really are, they really know about. So that can be a hurdle. We have these long lines also because in Georgia, we are definitely a working class state. Some people clock in at 7 o'clock in the morning and they clock out at 4:30, or they're clocking in at 8 a.m. and they're clocking out at 5 p.m. So we're going to have a mad rush of people who are trying to get to the polls before their work hours and after their work hours. Here in Georgia, we don't have instituted voting leave. Like I have flexibility with my work where I have 2 hours of voting leave, so I can go whenever I please to actually go vote. Most Georgians don't have that. We don't also have paid sick leave that people also use to actually go vote too. So we have a truncated time where a lot of people are going to try to go vote in the beginning of the voting hours, at the end of the voting hours. And then we have limited days of early voting. Yes, it's a great thing that we have early voting here in Georgia, but we have limited hours for Saturday voting, and we don't actually have Sunday voting here. So that can also be a hurdle for voters. We know that we're in a state of a pandemic, and the pandemic is not going away. COVID is here. And there's a lot of people like myself, we're at home with our children, and so they could be homeschooling. So there's only a limited amount of time where people actually can actually go out and vote. So we saw some of those long lines because of that. We also saw that in our polling places, we want everyone to be safe, even our poll workers and our staff in our polling locations. So they're making sure that they're taking measures to social distance while they're in the polling place to make sure that everyone is safe while we're actually casting our ballots. But on the other hand, on the other side, that yes, we can say that was a big hurdle, and we had these very long lines for 2 to 3 to 8 to 9 hours, but it also shows the resiliency of Georgians that they actually want to vote. They actually want to stand in line to make sure that their ballot is cast. We have a new system of the way we're actually coming into the ballot process. So we have different options this time around. So we have a lot of people who've requested a vote by mail ballot. We have people who are actually going to go to the precincts to vote. So we want to make sure that everyone is safe and secure. And I think that's what really happened on the first day of voting. Yes, we had over 128, I think it was over 128,000 folks who voted on the first day of early voting. And that was great. And people stood in line for those 9 hours. So that really shows the people like, hey, yes, we have issues here, but we're resilient and we're going to make sure that our ballots are cast in any way we can get them cast at this point in time.
Great. I'm really interested in how Georgia is changing. You know, we see all these new voters, and I'm sure you see that too. What is it that's changing about Georgia? Is it just so many more people want to live here and they're living in the cities, and that's what's making Georgia a more closely divided state politically?
I think in Georgia here, it's a very popular state to come in. If you go on our interstate, you can tell because it's always a traffic jam. I tell people who are coming and transient and visiting from the outside that our rush hour starts at 10 a.m. and it ends at 6 p.m. So just be careful if you get on the interstate, learn the streetways. So our population is definitely booming. Georgia used to be this very sleepy state to people in Atlanta, particularly the metro area, was this sleepy town that has like this southern charm, but it just draws you in like our southern drawl draws folks in. So I do think that that comes into why we have this large population and this large boom of people who are voting in Georgia. But also, people actually want to be a part of the political process. And being part of the political process is actually exercising your ballot and having your voice count. And how do you have your voice count? Is actually participating in our voting process. So we do see a lot of energy around this election from both sides, the Republican side, the Libertarian side, the Green Party side, the Democratic side. Whatever way you are voting, there's a lot of energy around this election, and there's a lot of energy to make sure that people want to actually be a part of this cycle. So I do think that's why we have so many people who've registered to vote. We see that there's so many people who stood in line on Monday because there's this different energy around this election.
Great. I want to take a minute to talk about who Georgia's voters are, what we can tell from public information about who voters are. And of course, people make individual choices, but there are patterns that you can see. You can talk to political scientists and know that, for example, older people are more likely to vote Republican, younger people are more likely to vote Democrat, or white people are more likely to vote Republican, and minorities are more likely to vote Democrat. So, you know, that doesn't mean that anybody will vote one way or another, but you can see patterns when you look at Georgia's changing population to kind of infer why things are getting so closely divided here in Georgia. And I think I misspoke earlier. There are 200,000 new voters since July. I think I said 400,000. But yeah,
that's a great number.
Yeah, 7.6 million voters, and just in today, and it's been less than 3 months since it was
Right.
7.4 million. And you know, you can see that you know how it breaks down by race. About 30% African American, about 53% white. The biggest subcategory is unknown, people who don't declare a race when they register to vote. That's a growing population as people become less willing to disclose their race to the government. So that does leave some ambiguity in exactly who those people are. And you know, our voting population, Hispanic is 3.4%, Asian Pacific 2.5%, and then other and American Indian below that. What's really impressive to me is the increase in the number of young voters that we've seen. You know, if you look at voters under 35 years old and just even compare from May to July, you can see that they grew by 2% just in that age group alone. That's the biggest increase. You know, May to July is not long, and just in that short period of time, we had that growth in people of under 35. Interestingly, the age group, every group grew a little bit except for those over 65. They actually lost numbers in those couple of months. And so it kind of makes sense. You see people under 35 years old being the most mobile people, the people who are most likely to be moving to Georgia and become newly registered here. And, it's really interesting how this plays into exactly what we're seeing with the polls of how close Georgia is. We saw, I think, a couple of polls yesterday that showed Biden ahead of Trump in the presidential race. Most polls before that showed Trump with a narrow lead. And so I think we'll continue to see it maybe flip back and forth. The AJC's own poll that we conducted through the University of Georgia, it showed that the race was tied at about 47% each. But as we get closer to election day, those number of undecideds, which was always small, is going to get lower and lower and lower. What do you think the rest of the nation sees Georgia as? Do you think Georgia could be a tipping point state, when people are waiting for results to come in? Or, I think many people look at states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Do you think Georgia's in that conversation?
I think that I can say that people think that Georgia's definitely in play, and we are in play. We do have a large population boom, but as you mentioned, we have a large boom in registrations here in Georgia due to automatic voter registration, due to energy around representation and energy around actually getting our voices to count. And we do see that there's industries here that are very popular for folks to come down here. That's been adding to that energy and that population of people who will be getting out to vote and to exercise. But I do think that what people are seeing in those margin of numbers is that Georgia's turning into what we can say a kind of a purplish blue red mosaic. So we're really excited as we get closer to election day to really see how those numbers, that gap closes, and what that will look like for years to come and elections to come here in Georgia, because it does seem like that Georgia does this teetering, but we don't know where the balancing board will be until November 3rd. But speaking of November 3rd, when at that balancing point, when we're counting those votes, we also have to continue to manage our expectations of, yes, the world is watching Georgia, the country's watching Georgia, and no, we're not in Pennsylvania or Michigan, so we're not considered, battleground territory, but we're mosaicing and bleeding purple and blue and red. But we do know when we're counting those ballots that it may take a couple weeks for those numbers to come in. So we'll be watching for a couple of weeks with election protection and others to see what that count will actually look like.
Yeah, it's so interesting. We got an audience question. Will Georgia turn blue this year? I don't know. We'll see.
We'll see.
It's so close, and you know how polls go. One poll shows one thing, another poll shows another thing, and politicians, they say this all the time, and forgive me if you've heard this over and over again, but the only poll that counts is the one on election day. And so we'll all know in the days after the election, after all the votes counted, what Georgia is this year. I found it really interesting. I was reading an article on 538 about whether Georgia is, how much of a swing state Georgia is this year. And, because of the recent polls, they nudged Georgia into the blue category. It might go back to the red category a few times with every poll that comes out. It might go back and forth. But the point that analysis made, and one that I think is true, is that Georgia is unlikely to be the state that the whole nation is depending on, because, if Biden does win in Georgia, that also means it's very likely that he's winning in other swing states such as North Carolina or Florida or Ohio. Georgia, there is always a chance that Georgia could be the state that makes the difference in the country for either President Trump or Joe Biden. But really, of course, Georgia is important. I don't know if it's very likely that Georgia will be the state where that will make all the difference for the presidency, but it could be. And especially at the Senate, we have 2 Senate races, and really there, that could make the big difference between who controls the Senate, and it might come down to runoffs in January. That's a distinct possibility. And just to quickly go over those races, because there's a lot of confusion over that. There's a regularly scheduled Senate race, and that's between Democrat John Ossoff and Republican Senator David Perdue. And that's the main one that's regularly scheduled. Then there's the special election to fill out the term of former Senator Johnny Isakson. There's the incumbent Republican Senator Kelly Loeffler, and she's joined by 20 other competitors, including Democrat Raphael, Republican Congressman Doug Collins, Democrats Ed Tarver and Matt Lieberman, and then a bunch on November 3rd would need more than 50% of all the votes, which is very unlikely in a 21 candidate race. So that one is pretty much going to a runoff, we think. So that's interesting. I'd love to hear your questions. What are you wondering about that will happen?
Let's see. Things that Aunna is wondering about what will happen with this election. I'm wondering about more of like the localized participation when it comes to our down ballot race. Sometimes folks think about the top of the ticket when they think about the presidential race, but when you are in your local community and when you think about who's saying if your kids are going back to school in the midst of COVID, and who's saying who's going to pick up your trash, or what's happening with community safety. So I'm always wondering, what are people thinking about these DA races and these other races that are happening, and how they're going to actually come out for the ballot when it comes to our down ballot races. So those are some things that I think about daily. And then I also think about, of course, what's going to happen if we go into extended hours on election day. Since it feels like since 2014, I've noticed that we've gone into extended hours on election days in our Black and brown communities, and we will need to have more emergency paper ballots to be able to be used. But our state has said only 10% is sufficient. And we've recently asked in a legal case, can you define what is sufficient, and can we have 20% to 40% to match the population? And we've been told 10% is sufficient enough, and we need more remedies. So we need more state procedures to allow for more balloting options and more ballots in the form of paper ballots for election days. So those are things that are on the top of my mind at this point.
Right. The big thing with those emergency paper ballots is even getting them used a lot of times. Poll workers and poll managers and election supervisors are reluctant to switch systems even when there are long waits, but they might have to. And if they do have to, everybody needs to be able to have a ballot to vote. I wanted to go back to what I teased earlier, Georgia's changing voting patterns. If you look back to the 2000 presidential election, George W. Bush had a 12% percentage point margin over Al Gore. And then 2004, that even grew higher to 17%. But then since 2008, with the race between Barack Obama and John McCain, it's gotten much closer. McCain had a 5 percentage point lead in 2008, and then in 2012, Republicans gained a little ground in that election with an 8 percentage point lead. But then in 2016, 5 percentage points in the Trump versus Hillary Clinton race. And then if you look at Governor Kemp versus Democrat Stacey Abrams, 1.4 percentage point margin. You can see it's getting closer and closer in Georgia, and it's all leading up to November 3rd. We had an audience question about absentee voting. This is a question that a lot of people are thinking about. They received an absentee ballot, or they requested an absentee ballot and didn't receive it, and then they decide they want to vote in person instead. And the question is, can you do that? And the answer is yes, you can. You can vote in person after requesting an absentee ballot, but you do have to go through a little bit of a hassle. It goes a lot faster if you have your absentee ballot with you, because in the envelope, and then the poll workers can cancel it right there, because that's proof that you haven't voted yet. Right. If you don't have your absentee ballot with you, you have to fill out some paperwork. Sometimes poll workers have to call into the county office just to make sure you haven't returned your ballot. Some counties, because you have a live connection to the election database during early voting, some counties have changed their processes so they don't have to make that call. But generally speaking, counties and poll workers will make that call to make sure you haven't voted already. And then after that process is complete, they cancel your absentee ballot and you will be issued a voter access card to vote on the voting computer on Georgia's new voting system. So it is possible. Lots of people are doing it. One thing I'm going to be doing is looking at the numbers to find out how many people are switching from absentee to in-person voting. During the primary, it was about 150,000. I expect it'll probably be, I don't know if it'll be higher or lower because that's a lot of numbers, but I do hear this from a lot of people, especially those who are worried about whether their absentee ballot will count or those who have been waiting for it to arrive in the mail. And one more important point about absentee voting, there is still time to absentee vote, to request an absentee ballot and to return it. Counties are taking over the mailing of absentee ballots, so the mail will be done locally. You will get your absentee ballot relatively quickly after requesting it between now and Election Day. But it is very important that your absentee ballot be received at your county's elections office by 7 p.m. on November 3rd. If you choose to mail your absentee ballot, you need to get it in the mail well in advance to make sure you meet that deadline. But if you're at the last minute and you still have your absentee ballot, or even beforehand, you can use a drop box. Drop boxes have been set up across the state and they're emptied frequently. Many of the large counties, they're getting so much volume, they're emptying them daily. And they will definitely be emptying them daily in the days leading up to the election. And as long as your absentee ballot is in that drop box by 7 p.m. on Election Day, it will be counted.
And to speak on that absentee ballot portion, when I actually went to go vote with my daughter, yesterday we went to go vote in our local community early voting location that we've been going to for years. My great-grandmother was a poll worker in that area, so we always go back to that area as a family to go vote. And when I was actually doing the check-in process, I did hear that there were actually folks who were canceling their absentee ballot because they wanted to vote in person. So it's definitely something that people are doing. And I did notice that the poll workers were giving them the right information because I was doing a little ear hustling because, you know, I'm right there. So I was ear hustling a little bit. And I did notice that that was actually something that was taking place. In the June primary, when I was monitoring some precincts, I did talk to voters who actually did submit their request for their absentee ballot and they didn't receive it, and so that's why they were in line for 5 to 6 to 8 hours at this precinct. And they heard from the counties that some of them said, oh, the signature didn't match, or they just didn't get a ballot at all. And now fast forward 4 months later, we do have some new things in place that we do commend the Secretary of State's office on doing, is instituting this portal where people can request and track their absentee ballot, which is actually a good thing because it lets you know what's a lifeline of what's happening to your ballot. However, we do know from talking to folks who have requested their ballot that some folks have been waiting up to 16 days to get their ballots because our vendor for our ballots in Georgia is coming from Arizona. That's a very far away to get some ballots. So we do know that's also why people stood in line on the first day of early voting, because that is actually still a hurdle that we're hoping to continue to advocate and to make it easier for Georgia voters.
Right. With the mail from Arizona, usually it is taking about 4 or 5 days once they put it in the mail. The real issue is getting it there, verifying the data, uploading it, and getting the ballot package printed, processed, and put in the mail. But as I said, from now on, the mail will come locally from your county, so it should be a faster turnaround for those people who still want to vote absentee from now on. And my view is that absentee voting is safe and secure, but some people aren't comfortable with that, and that is just fine. People should vote in the way they're most comfortable to ensure that their vote is counted, and that's why we're seeing such high turnout in early voting so far. And it'll be really interesting. You mentioned 128,000 people on the first day of early voting on Monday. On Wednesday, it was even higher. Just yesterday, and we're getting these numbers in every night around midnight. It'll continue to grow, most likely. That's usually the pattern we see every election, and those last 2 days, the Thursday and Friday before the election, are the busiest days. So election officials would love for voters to come
Yes.
before those last 2 days. Don't wait in line if you can avoid it. Get your vote in. And of course, if you do wait to the last minute, that's fine, but you can avoid the lines if you come a little bit sooner. We've already seen the lines go down significantly today compared to earlier in the week.
Yeah.
So that's a very good sign. And then election day will be really interesting to see how much turnout is. In past years, you see more early voting is a signal that people are really excited about the election and are going to show up on election day. But this year, I wonder how many people are voting early instead of election day. That's always what election officials are hoping for, that people will be voting early to take off the load on election day. But in the past, anyway, heavy turnout in early voting has just been a signal showing heavy turnout overall. And I don't know what we'll see. I think we will see a lot of people voting early instead of in person, but it's still going to be high. Maybe 1.6 million people on election day which would be about twice as much as we had on election day in the primary. So that will wrap us up for this week's session of our Facebook chats on elections. We have a lot of great sessions coming up. Next week is our biggest one. We will have the Secretary of State as a guest. We will have a voting machine demonstration. We will have our editor-in-chief, Kevin Riley, moderating with other reporters present to really go through with our chief elections official about how all these things are working and what he is seeing in his position as overseeing elections for the entire state, although of course counties do run most of the functions, but he is the top elections official, and we really look forward to hearing from him and hope that you all join us for that community conversation with the AJC. So stay tuned. As I said, there's still time to request an absentee ballot. Early voting lasts until Friday, October 30th. And thank you, Aunna Dennis, for joining us. We really appreciate your knowledge and work. And I also have to urge you to please continue reading our coverage at ajc.com and the print edition of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And stay tuned for coverage, hopefully tomorrow, on the latest numbers and what is happening with Georgia's voters and how much it has changed just in the last few months and compared with 2016. So thank you so much.